Hi, you're on the Nomad of Dreams channel. Today, I'll talk about the philosophy of Zen, about what it lives by, and how its ideas become a support for the practice of life. We'll talk about the direct experience of the mind, about how words give way to action, and about why attention to the present changes ordinary everydayness. The topic is important because Zen offers not a set of rules, but a way of finally testing one's own perception. A path that is tested in every moment, not in theoretical constructions. Where are you listening from? And what time of day is it for you now? Write it in the comments. I like seeing the geography and the hours. It helps connect with those who listen at different times. Take a deep breath now. Roll your shoulders back and feel the rhythm of your breath. This is a simple anchor that coincides with what will be discussed. Zen can be called a thinking practice that places direct testing of the mind at its center. It is not an academic system, but a way of arranging attention and action so that truth reveals itself in the very experience. Its mode of thought is practice-oriented. Ideas serve to be lived through, not to be used as pure concepts. Thinking remains active because it answers the basic human need to test life right here and right now. It gives tools that work when applied in the body and in simple actions. I will explain the philosophy of Zen as a chain of key ideas and their logic, without biographies and historical digressions. This explanation is built on the premise that each idea is not an abstract thesis, but a criterion by which one can check one's own experience. Important is not only the verbal formula, but the possibility to feel how it works in a concrete movement, glance, or breath. For me, such an approach means attentive work with the habit of mind, with those moments where concept and experience diverge. There will be no substitution of practice by words here. The talk is about how thought meets the body. Sitting, movement, carrying out ordinary tasks become places of testing. Words come later to point, but the pointing loses power if not confirmed by bodily knowing. This knowing comes through simple but strict exercises of attention, and through repetition that changes automatic behavior. Discipline manifests as bodily, through breathing, posture, the rhythm of action, and through a constant readiness to return to the clarity of the moment. Transmission of understanding often occurs face to face, through the situation, and touching the specific question of the student. Such a mode of transmission is not devoid of gentleness, and at the same time contains sharpness. It is aimed at exposing falsity when it meets the sincerity of intention. Intention becomes a practical criterion. Motive distinguishes a casual play from real work. Intention is seen not in words, but in the qualities of attention a person brings to action. Zen addresses the presence of being present as the field of testing. The present functions as the only measure of what is transparent and what is still covered by a thick layer of habitual thinking. This is not an abstraction of emptiness, but the experience of relief from the dissolving for a time of divisions and fixed images, so perception can renew. Such an experience clears the space of choice and simultaneously makes action clearer and more integral. Practice does not detach from everyday life. Its meaning manifests where routine becomes an arena for attention. The idea of awakening is tied to how simple things are done: a cup of tea, a step, an answer to a question. In everydayness, the testing of the mind's direct pointing appears. Small, repeating moments become keys to a deeper change in the habit of reacting. Consistency of practice gives rise to spontaneity, and spontaneity, trust in the skill built through discipline. Words and texts serve as signposts, but do not replace the path. They point the way. However, the power of understanding is revealed only in the moment of experience. That means that reading and discussion make sense when they are nourished by returning attention to the body and to action. This approach gives freedom from formal worship of writings, and at the same time, respect for what is transmitted as living experience. The relationship with a teacher in this practice differs by a cautious directness. The teacher acts as a mirror. The reflection can be gentle when it supports, and sharp when it helps to see deep-rooted self-deceptions. The interaction remains oriented toward the result of the experience, not an appeal to authority. This creates an environment where testing the honesty of intention becomes the norm of interaction. My speech will aim for clarity and simplicity, because Zen evaluates clarity not by the elegance of words, but by how they help tune attention. I will try to keep the focus on ideas that are easy to test in one's own experience. The first thought we will move to concerns the direct pointing to the mind as the path to awakening. I will analyze it so that one can find entry points into one's own practice, small actions and habits through which perception begins to change. Everything I speak about will have a pragmatic orientation, exactly how ideas turn into ways of action and testing. In the next material, the discussion will be about how the moment of clarity is recognized, what movements of the mind accompany it, and what practice requests help hold that state. The approach will be calm and concrete, with an emphasis on experience, because the testing of truth in Zen happens in what a person does right now. Knowledge in Zen comes through the instantaneous contact of the mind. It is a transmission that bypasses letters and reasoning and acts as a sudden response in the body and perception. This contact is felt as direct recognition. It is like the moment when gaze meets gaze, and in that collision, the gap between meaning and sensation disappears. Speech restricts and fixes. Here, what matters is that part of experience where the word has already retreated, and what remains is pure clarity of perception. In practice, this shows up in the tone of voice, in silence, in the movement of the body, in the sitting posture, and in how one asks and answers. Transmission becomes bodily. The body signals to the mind responds through breathing and through the lightness with which discussion disappears. The intensity of such contact is determined not by the amount said, but by the coincidence of intention and presence. Intention is visible in the direction of attention, in the readiness to be vulnerable to the moment. The mechanics of this process are hidden in everyday details. Transmission passes through the tuning of attention, through the simple directness of the one who asks, and through the readiness of the student to accept a sensation that does not fit into preconstructed schemes. I have seen how a phrase said evenly and calmly works differently than a long explanation. The difference is that a phrase can act like a key to an already prepared lock, while a long explanation more often sews the meaning into the fabric of reasoning. Preparing the lock includes regular work with the body, with breathing, with ordinary tasks where attention accumulates and becomes able to receive the flash of recognition. It is important to recognize moments when attention is upright and when it is scattered. In the first case, contact is possible and it is often quick. The boundary of this mode of transmission runs through conditions of presence and readiness. Transmission beyond words is effective when the listener is right here, when the body is open, when the intention is pure, and when the context allows speaking in silence. In situations of remote reading of a text or rapid informational overload, that very contact is harder to establish because the common temporal, bodily support is absent. At the same time, knowledge as instantaneous recognition is not a magical substance that can be poured into a vessel. It arises in a specific act of connection. Discipline is required to prepare for reception and participation. The teacher points, the student responds, and the arising movement is confirmed by bodily knowing. The boundary is visible also by the result, by how the attitude to the experience has changed a minute after contact. If the attitude remains the same, the contact was weak. If the attitude has shifted, the contact worked deeper. Dogen Daikin paid attention precisely to this living transmission and noted the value of direct experience more than literal adherence to texts. For Dogen Daikin, writing served as a prompt, while sitting and interaction became the place to test what was considered true. Dogen Daikin showed that transmission can be expressed through a simple action, through a corrected position of the body, and through calm breathing, which together with focused attention create an environment for instantaneous recognition. In Dogen Daikin's words, there is often the idea that doctrine becomes living when it ceases to be an idea and turns into a way of being here. When you strive for such contact, your own scale of readiness matters. Competing with someone is pointless. It is enough to feel how the tone of your attention changes when someone speaks briefly and precisely. This shift can be small and barely noticeable, but it indicates movement. I suggest observing precisely these small changes: how the jaw relaxes, how the breathing evens out, how the feverish attempts to understand meaning in words dissipate. These signs show that knowledge has passed into the body and become part of the experience. Transmission outside the text implies respect for the body and for silence as authorities of experience. This form of knowledge requires personal responsibility. The teacher can point, support, push, but for the contact to be fixed, one needs one's own attention and one's own return to practice. The trajectory is formed by a sequence of actions, not a collection of dogmas. The sequence turns a single contact into a stable quality of perception. It is important to maintain a sense of measure, neither to rush the experience nor to get stuck in searching for a miracle. Bodily practice and simple honesty before the moment become the frame in which instantaneous recognition finds support. Dogen Daikin leads to the thought that truth manifests in the instantaneous acquaintance of the mind with itself, and that this meeting often passes in silence. It is in Dogen Daikin that one can find a constant return to the practice that makes this transmission possible. Sitting, attention to breathing, repetition of simple actions with full commitment. I refer to his emphasis to show transmission outside words is not counterculture, but a mature form of transmission that requires work and respect for the body. When you encounter such a moment, it is like opening a window in a dark room. Light enters immediately and without intermediate explanations, and then words become only a confirmation of what was experienced. Let this focus remain a criterion for you. Seek, train attention, observe how the body changes, and remember the boundary that separates superficial understanding from real recognition. It is precisely through such preparation and through sincere readiness for contact, that Zen knowledge becomes alive and working right here in each of your movements and in every breath. The problem is that sitting practice often becomes separated from what it should change in you. Zazen remains a set of rules about the position of the hands and the position of the back, a ritual before sleep or a way to relieve tension, but it does not penetrate the subtle structures of attention and the body. When breathing and posture become ornament and attention keeps old habits, daydreaming, planning, fleeting judgments, the effect is limited. The practice then exists alongside life, not inside it, and knowledge remains a declaration rather than a living sensation. The criterion of authentic Zazen is simple and concrete. A genuine session is measured not by the complexity of techniques, but by how the relationship between body and attention changes. Your back straightens naturally. Breathing becomes even without effort. Internal speech takes on the rhythm of pauses. And in that body, a subtle but distinct ability to stay with what is arises. Intention here is visible not as a word, but as a steady tone of presence that withstands returns of attention. Dogen Daiken pointed out that sitting is an expression of awakening. The criterion is not correctness of form, but how much the form enlivens attention. When the criterion is met, consequences are visible in everyday details. Hands washing the dishes move differently because you feel their support and weight. Conversations become shorter and fuller because listening is not interrupted by internal commentary. One short observation is better than 1,000 inferences. If you can sit without an internal plan for the next step, you will gain the ability to do what is necessary now. This is not the effect of a practice technique, but a shift of control. Previously, habitual reactions dominated. Now choice is determined by the aliveness of attention. The mechanics of transformation are simple and subtle at the same time. The body serves as the environment for the mind. The position of the pelvis and relaxed holding of neck and shoulder muscles set a support on which attention can stand. Breathing functions as a marker. Its rhythm shows the level of involvement in the thought stream. Repeated return of attention to the support and to the breath strengthens the neural pathways responsible for presence, and over time the action itself becomes automatic, not as a blind habit, but as an ability to act with clarity. Dogen Daiken drew attention to the fact that each sitting is a training of body and mind together, and this joint training changes the structure of responding. Consequences manifest not only in sensual changes, but also in the ethics of presence. When attention gains stability, motivation for action becomes transparent. You see what moves you and can choose otherwise. This affects relationships, work, and everyday duties. Decisions are made with greater clarity. Task after task becomes a way of practice, not merely a means to achieve benefit or status. Practice ceases to be a zone of separate time and becomes a way of life, because sitting affects how you breathe in movement, how you listen in conversation, how you take up a tool. A short observation can put many things in their place. Sitting and lingering on the feeling of support under the sit bones, you will notice how the habitual fussiness of the hands disappears and the sense of balance returns. This small shift in the body is often accompanied by a clarity of mind that lasts longer than the sitting moment. The boundary of practice is clear and tangible. It runs where sitting ceases to change modes of attention and remains an external ritual. If the posture is perfectly arranged and inner speech continues to control every movement, sitting loses its power. Another boundary is the attempt to accelerate the effect by forceful techniques, Effort aimed at propping up presence creates tension and substitutes the subtlety of practice with mechanics of will. Dogen Daiken repeatedly returned attention to the fact that the power of sitting is in both effortlessness and discipline at once. Discipline without gentleness remains an exercise. Gentleness without discipline dissipates. The practical test is clear. It will require several consecutive actions. A regular return to sitting, attention to the body of the cushion, and honesty about what changes after a session. If after a week of sittings you notice that irritation at small things decreases, and decisions become shorter in time and clearer in content, the practice is going deeper. If there are no changes, you need to look at conditions. Perhaps the breath is constricted. Perhaps the body position does not support attentiveness. Perhaps the intention dissolves into desire for a result. When working with this criterion, it is important to be patient and concrete in observations. Sitting is a tool, and the effect is measured not in unusual experiences, but in how the quality of your presence changes in the most ordinary tasks. I have seen how daily return to support transforms work habits and communication. I have seen how those who remain faithful to simple sitting become more skilled in tasks without additional struggle. Dogen Daiken left the thread by which the link between body and enlightenment can be traced, and to follow it means to approach practice with respect and patience. The limit of Zazen's application is determined by the availability of the body and the honesty of intention. When context is deprived of bodily support, long trips without a chance to sit, remote practices where attention is scattered, the influence of sitting diminishes. When motivation serves the search for fame or a unique experience, the practice loses direction. Therefore, the boundary is always visible by result and by the stability of changes. If presence remains a local flash, this indicates a need to change the approach. If presence takes root in daily actions, then Zazen works, and its method embodies awakening in the body and attention. The mechanism of the koan is simple in form and complex in action. A koan places a task before the mind that does not fit into the habitual chain of reasoning. When one tries to answer it by habitual means, the mind encounters a contradiction between its usual logic and the demand for immediate clarity. This collision creates tension within thought, which cannot be resolved by a habitual prepared answer. Through this tension, the automatic replaying of thoughts and images disappears, leaving pure sensitivity to the situation. The body and breath become markers of how much the lattice of thoughts has weakened. At the moment when logic stops saving the situation, another, intuitive, understanding is switched on, which is seen as a shift in breathing, in tone of voice, in the touches of attention. A koan acts like a physical blow to the wall of habitual thinking. The wall itself cracks, and through the crack another perception penetrates. Why this mechanism is needed? Direct contact with reality is blocked by habitual ideas about oneself and the world. A koan serves as an instrument that forces attention out of the shelter of intellectual habits and to look at the content of consciousness without props. This is important so that awakening does not remain a verbal construction or an aesthetic experience. Contact with immediate experience helps test how well your faith in explanations stands up to the test of the present. In the koanic gap, the criterion appears. What remains when habitual explanations disappear? Dogen Daiken said that practice should become lived bodily knowledge. A koan helps that knowledge break through the thickness of words and habitual reactions, where the mechanism breaks. The first case is when the koan is turned into an intellectual puzzle that can be solved by logic, citation memory, or clever argumentation. Then an illusion of achievement arises, and the state remains superficial. The second case is when the goal of practice is reduced to demonstrating a special state. Expectation of an exotic experience replaces sincere investigation, and attention closes again on images of the desired. The third case is incorrect reliance on external form instead of internal honesty. If posture, mantra, or ritual serve only as signal markers of success, the koan loses its cutting power. The fourth case is the absence of a reliable mirror of a teacher. If there is no one nearby who can gently and clearly point out the obstructions, the practitioner can get lost in their own cleverness and self-deception. The fifth case is the attempt to mechanically speed up the disclosure through effort of will and tension. The result then resembles short-term hyperexcitation rather than a durable change in the structure of attention. In Eastern traditions, these breakdowns were widely discussed, and Dogen Daiken warned that external strictness without inner sincerity turns out to be useless. Where else boundaries appear? Cultural and linguistic transfers influence the perception of a koan. A form born in the context of certain practical settings, when transferred to another context, requires adaptation. If a koan is presented as a riddle for the mind, it loses the very impact for which it was given. If it is presented as a test of status or proof of enlightenment, it becomes an instrument of power. It should be remembered that the koan form itself is neutral. Its strength depends on the depth and responsibility with which it is used. Dogen Daiken, exploring the connection between form and meaning, noted that practice must be imbued with life, not ritual repetition. The conclusion about how to apply the mechanism is simple and practically useful. A koan is effective when you hold it as a living question, and check the answer not intellectually but in the body and in the breath. Practice requires honesty, a readiness to discover your tendency for clever answers, to admit the fear of emptiness, and to allow yourself to remain with uncertainty. At the same time, you need the discipline of returning to the task again and again, since shifts are often small and rare. It is useful to look at ways out of dead ends as diagnostic data, where attention dissipates, which habits come between you and the question, which bodily tensions accompany intellectualization. If a teacher is present, they will show where attention is shifting and help preserve clarity when the mind suggests a ready-made answer. A practical note for everyday life. Take a koan not as an object of professional thinking, but as a constant trainer of the ability to be with the unknown. Use it in short episodes during the day, noting how your breath and the tone of attention change. Do not demand an instant revelation. Record small shifts and collect them into an honest observation about yourself. A koan is not a miraculous means that will by itself reveal the truth. It prepares the ground, breaks old habits, makes room for the next step. If you stay with that step and keep returning, not only understanding will change, but also your ability to act in life with greater clarity and honesty. An important point: do not separate practice from life. A koan works most deeply where there is no division between time for practice and ordinary affairs. Meetings, letters, household chores, All of this is material for testing. How capable are you of accepting incompleteness, of hearing the pause between thoughts, of not filling it with habitual answers? Start small. Give yourself short, easily doable koan reminders. One question in the morning, one during the day, one before sleep. Watch the tone of your inner voice and treat it as an indicator, not an authority. Also remember self-compassion. Practice reveals vulnerabilities, and it is important not to drive yourself into a new kind of violence for the sake of results. If you live with others, practice together at least sometimes. When you notice a shared pause, exchange observations. This accelerates mutual understanding. Ultimately, the goal is not to become a correct practitioner, but for clarity to become more available in actions and relationships without unnecessary dramatization. Discipline, attention, and benevolence. 3 supports that will sustain you on this path. How can you find out what happened to your mind at the moment of enlightenment if the word sudden slips away from ordinary time, while gradual stretches the event over years of practice and small changes in the body and attention? You have heard these terms, but the question is how to see them in your own life and how to respond when the shift either arrives abruptly or creeps in through subtle, almost imperceptible changes. Suddenness here describes the character of the experience, while gradualness reflects the background and consolidation. A sudden shift manifests as an instantaneous clarity, like a window flung open in experience. Gradualness shows up as the sequential removal of layers of habitual reactions, when body, breath, and choices gradually build a different structure. Both phenomena concern the single whole reality of mind and body. The mind is capable of opening space with one sharp movement of attention. At the same time, you have a habit that is broken by repeated actions. Habit is replaced by trained non-attachment through long-term practice and trials. One student sat for short periods over months, and one day, in the middle of a simple breath, he felt that his former fears had become like a distant picture, barely involving him in impulses. This feeling came suddenly, but many days of repetition had prepared it. The causes and structure of this process can be described as 3 levels: preparation of attention, the mechanics of breaking habitual logic, and integration of the experience into actions. Preparation includes discipline of body and breath, habits of returning to open attention, work on attachments. The mechanics of the breakdown consist in the emergence of an inflection in the dynamics of mental processes, when customary patterns stop providing answers and only pure sensitivity remains. The consequence is a reworked pattern of responding, when choices and movements become less dependent on old automatisms. It is precisely the combination of systematic practice and the capacity for an instantaneous shift that makes both depth and the viability of the opening possible. Hakuei Nekako emphasized that practice should be not only a sudden experience, but also a return into daily life, where the enlightened view is tested by time. Confusion often arises when the expectation of a miracle replaces honest practice. The desire to experience a sharp, illuminating moment can generate a superficial imitation of states. And the other extreme, treating gradual change as routine, losing sensitivity to sudden changes that may appear in the most ordinary situations. Both tendencies are possible, and the task of practice is to keep openness to instantaneous movements of mind while patiently honing body and attention. Dogen Daiken reminded us that practice and enlightenment do not exist apart. Sitting, walking, talking, All of this is an opportunity to manifest the changed state. It is important to develop the skill of recognizing that a true shift always enters the flow of your affairs and does not remain a parade of experiences. The role of a teacher and community in this process has practical value. A teacher can point out traps and support integration, help see where self-deceptive impressions have arisen.
The teaching of Bodhidharma passed on the idea of direct pointing, which can contribute to an instant overturning of attention. At the same time, a school requires repeated training so that the experience acquires stability. If there is a person nearby who can honestly reflect your tendencies, shifts become less vulnerable to pride and oversight. A teacher does not create enlightenment, but helps make the experience usable in life, and in doing so, becomes a tester of the sincerity of your practice. How to work practically so that both suddenness can occur and gradualness can follow its course. Introduce regular short periods of stopping attention, where body and breath serve as markers of change. Keep records of observations about what shifts in the tone of voice, in reactions to irritants, in choice of words. Set simple checks for yourself. Did you hold a pause before answering? Did you notice the tightness in the neck? Did you let go of a habitual judgment in conversation? Combine situational sensitivity with routine discipline. In koan practice and in Zazen, the same detail manifests differently. Sometimes a koan triggers a sharp collapse of analysis. Sometimes it serves as a prolonged anchor for observation. Dogen Daiken pointed out that one must work through all entryways, body, speech, and mind, so that the change does not remain a performance. There is a way to diagnose how much the opening truly transforms life. Look at the durability of changes in situations where a habitual reaction used to switch on automatically. Enlightenment gives not only a clear moment, but also a change in responses in daily affairs, in relationships, in the ability to stay with uncertainty without self-justifications. If the change holds only in words, it remains the same phenomenon under a new label. Hakuen and other masters gave instructions emphasizing testing in action. Living enlightenment manifests as a different quality of presence in routine life. A boundary to remember is related to expectation of results, to the chase for a sense of exceptionality, and to the error of thinking enlightenment is a final shield against suffering. Enlightenment changes the structure of relation to experiences, but does not remove all the complexity of life. Your task is to treat sudden insights as signals and use gradual changes as material for stability. Dogen Daiken emphasized that practice and enlightenment are in constant interaction, and in this interaction there is movement onward, not a fixed point of arrival. Remain honest about what occurs. Watch for changes in bodily markers. Return again and again to simple everyday checks. Then moments of elimination will blend with the walk of the day, and life will become a place where enlightenment can be measured by the quality of action and the clarity of presence. The experience of emptiness as reality changes the very quality of how you exist in the world. The inner tone becomes finer. Choices happen without the build-up of habitual rigidity. Relationships lose the hardness of objects and gain plasticity. You act differently because the habitual reliance on pre-constructed objects disappears. Not in the sense of losing content, but in the sense of giving up fixation. This lightness is not carelessness. It means a readiness to respond fully when the response is required, not by template. An action no longer issues from the fear of preserving the image of oneself. It arises as a response of the living field of the perceived.
Such change shows in simple things: breaking the habitual defense against criticism, the disappearance of the automatic urge to possess, calmness in the presence of pain or joy. Haku Inakaku returned attention to the fact that experienced emptiness manifests in actions, and by this the authenticity of the opening is measured. Why does such a shift arise, and how is it explained at the level of experience and practice? The most essential thing lies in the restructuring of the foundations of perception. What once seemed separate and self-existing turns out to be interdependent and devoid of an enduring essence. The internal mechanisms of the habitual mind, the habit of connecting, labeling, holding, lose their power as practice develops the ability to see the movement of phenomena without grasping them into names. Breath, attention, bodily steadiness work as counterstructures. Repeated returns to simple presence gradually blur rigid schemes, and at a certain moment, a reconfiguration of response occurs. This reconfiguration can be understood as a change in the network of causes and effects within your experience. If previously the old reaction was a habitual knot, now knots loosen, and the answer is born in a transparent field. Dogen Daiken often spoke of this as not an intellectual operation, but the restructuring of a way of life in which body and mind discipline each other. Emptiness is experienced not as an idea, but as a quality of felt space. It is like the breadth of a room after the extra furniture has been removed. There is room to move. The details become audible. The density that interfered with listening disappears. In the body, this is felt as a loosening of tightness in the chest, as the disappearance of the constant inner commentary. Attention expands, but is not filled with thought. It becomes a container for actions to arise without the tyranny of past habits. Here it is important to clarify boundaries. Emptiness is not equivalent to nothingness. It does not destroy the contents of life. It turns contents into phenomena that come and go. And from this relation, freedom of choice is born. Emptiness as an experience means that you see events in their interdependence and live with that clarity. Bodhidharma led toward the idea that direct experience turns an abstraction into a living support for resolving everyday tasks. The link between experience and instruction is important, so that change does not remain a rare mystical flash. Practice aimed at familiarizing you with emptiness requires methods that return you to body, speech, and action. A koan can break the cardboard box of habitual meanings. Sitting inserts openness into the flesh of life. Everyday obligations become a place of testing. Nagarjuna, in the Treatise on Dependent Origination, named the mechanism by which the disappearance of the self-existence of phenomena leads to liberation from fixations. This idea in Zen becomes a practical requirement. Train in responding without guarding the image of self. When you check changes in your affairs, when you notice that the need to prove your rightness or defend the position has fallen away, then emptiness ceases to be a word and becomes something that lives in your actions. Dogen Daiken and Haku Inakaku pointed out that true experience manifests in the everyday movements of mind and body. And it is this testing that separates an authentic lived opening from a pretty idea. Watch how your readiness to listen changes, how the density of responses changes, and use these markers to return practice to life. The experience of emptiness as reality changes the very quality of how you exist in the world. The inner tone becomes finer, choices happen without the buildup of habitual rigidity, relationships lose the hardness of objects and gain plasticity. You act differently because the habitual reliance on preconstructed objects disappears. Not in the sense of losing content, but in the sense of giving up fixation. This lightness is not carelessness. It means a readiness to respond fully when a response is required, not by template. An action no longer issues from the fear of preserving the image of oneself. It arises as a response of the living field of the perceived. Such change shows in simple things: breaking the habitual defense against criticism, the disappearance of the automatic urge to possess, calmness in the presence of pain or joy. Haku Kaku returned attention to the fact that experienced emptiness manifests in actions, and by this, the authenticity of the opening is measured. Why does such a shift arise, and how is it explained at the level of experience and practice? The most essential thing lies in the restructuring of the foundations of perception. What once seemed separate and self-existing turns out to be interdependent and devoid of an enduring essence. The internal mechanisms of the habitual mind, the habit of connecting, labeling, holding, lose their power as practice develops the ability to see the movement of phenomena without grasping them into names.
Breath, attention, bodily steadiness work as counter-structures. Repeated returns to simple presence gradually blur rigid schemes, and at a certain moment, a reconfiguration of response occurs. This reconfiguration can be understood as a change in the network of causes and effects within your experience. If previously the old reaction was a habitual knot, now knots loosen, and the answer is born in a transparent field. Dogen Daiken often spoke of this as not an intellectual operation, but a restructuring of a way of life, in which body and mind discipline each other. Emptiness is experienced not as an idea, but as a quality of felt space. It is like the breath of a room after the extra furniture has been removed. There is room to move, the details become audible, the density that interfered with listening disappears. In the body, this is felt as a loosening of tightness in the chest, as the disappearance of the constant inner commentary. Attention expands, but is not filled with thought. It becomes a container for actions to arise without the tyranny of past habits. Here, it is important to clarify boundaries. Emptiness is not equivalent to nothingness. It does not destroy the contents of life. It turns contents into phenomena that come and go, and from this relation, freedom of choice is born. Emptiness as an experience means that you see events in their interdependence and live with that clarity. Bodhidharma led toward the idea that direct experience turns an abstraction into a living support for resolving everyday tasks. The link between experience and instruction is important, so that change does not remain a rare, mystical flash. Practice aimed at familiarizing you with emptiness requires methods that return you to body, speech, and action. A koan can break the cardboard box of habitual meanings. Sitting inserts openness into the flesh of life. Everyday obligations become a place of testing. Nagarjuna, in the treatise on dependent origination, named the mechanism by which the disappearance of the self-existence of phenomena leads to liberation from fixations. This idea in Zen becomes a practical requirement. Train in responding without guarding the image of self. When you check changes in your affairs, when you notice that the need to prove your rightness or defend a position has fallen away, then emptiness ceases to be a word and becomes something that lives in your actions. Dogen Daiken and Hakuine Kaku
pointed out that true experience manifests in the everyday movements of mind and body. And it is this testing that separates an authentic, lived opening from a pretty idea. Watch how your readiness to listen changes, how the density of responses changes, and use these markers to return practice to life. Practice requires gradualness and honesty. Do not wait for dramatic revelations. Change is most often quiet and gradual, like the growth of roots, which is imperceptible in daily observation. It is important not to chase metaphysical notions, but to observe how presence unfolds in each concrete task, in conversation, in work, in caring for the home. When a conversation slides into habitual defenses or into attempts to compare and judge, notice it, pause, and return to the body, to the breath, to the grounding of the feet, to softness in the throat. Such reframing returns choice to the field of sensation, where it is lighter and more precise. It is also important to maintain kindness to yourself and to others as a constant background. Otherwise, emptiness easily turns into cold apathy or intellectual nihilism. Kindness is not without trace. It becomes a means of returning to the body and softens judgmental reactions. A practical approach also requires clarity about boundaries. Presence of emptiness does not mean renouncing form or responsibility. Form and discipline remain important, but now they serve not to root the ego, but to support the space where a free response can appear. Reciprocity and the practice of responsible presence become a test of sincerity. Check yourself in how your clarity affects others. Does it make them freer, or does it serve a new form of power? If emptiness brings relief to one person at the expense of another, that is no longer enlightenment, but another mask of the ego. Therefore, feedback from teachers and community is important in practice. They help recognize blind spots of complacency. A teacher does not replace your experience, but points to its consequences and supports the honesty of the inquiry. In the end, emptiness is not a state to be preserved as a trophy, but the ability to live directly in what is, without cover and without whitening. Let practice be your orientation. Test how emptiness manifests in simple affairs. Trust the body, keep kindness, and do not forget to ask others. It is through living interaction that it gains much of its meaning. Once, while doing ordinary work, you suddenly stopped. Your hands did what they always did, but attention did not take up the habitual stories about success and failure. The tea remained on the table. The conversation continued. And at some moment the answer sounded simple and clear, without an inner struggle to justify or preserve an image. This brief event is an example of how emptiness enters everyday life as a practical force. What happens in such a minute can be described as a shifting of support. Usually the mind holds the world on a chain of categories and labels, like a player holding cards to win. In the moment of presence, the cards are laid out, and actions become transparent. This is not a philosophical metaphor. It is a change in the quality of perception and response. The body keeps the rhythm, the breath suggests the tempo, but the thought background ceases to dominate. Dogen Daikin drew attention to the need for practice to root itself in the everyday movement of life. And it is precisely such small episodes that serve as tests for the authenticity of the opening. If you consider this particular case more broadly, a systemic explanation emerges. Emptiness is perceived as a field in which rigid divisions between subject and object disappear. The mechanics are simple. Habitual habits of thinking create knots of attachment, and regular returns to bodily support and attention
gradually untie those knots. Breath and simple attention act as a soft but constant correction. Haku and Ekaku emphasize the practical side of such unbinding, showing that insight begins in the body and manifests in actions. When the knots loosen, choices become freer and are more easily expressed in concrete deeds. In this overall picture, it is important to speak about signs. You notice a reduction of the inner commentary, a diminished need to justify yourself, a lessened compulsion to control. In relationships, the urge to hold someone in a mental image disappears, and instead, a listening arises in which the other can be whole. At work, rigidity of plans decreases, and a flexibility of response to what is directly in front of you appears. Nagarjuna, in his analysis of the dependence of phenomena, pointed out that such an awareness of interdependence frees one from fixations. This liberation does not mean passivity. It creates a field for more precise and responsible action. From a practical standpoint, recognizing emptiness requires criteria. The first criterion is a tangible connection between attention and the body. If a thought is easily pushed back after returning to the breath, that is a signal. The second criterion is a change in motivation. Action no longer serves to reinforce the self, but arises as a response to the situation. The third criterion is an ethical correlation. The manifestation of emptiness makes other people more free, not less. Dogen Daiken repeatedly insisted that the verification of an awakening happens in deeds, and this verification requires honest feedback from life and from people around you. Despite all the positive aspects, there are natural limitations. Emptiness as an experience is easily interpreted by the mind as a theory and turns into an ideology of behavior. If you begin to regard emptiness as a criterion of your own spiritual validity, a new layer of attachment will appear. It is important to keep clarity about the boundaries of application. Relaxation of inner control does not absolve responsibility for the consequences of actions. In emergencies, decisiveness and form remain necessary. Bodhidharma spoke of direct experience, but this direct experience is always located in the body, and the body is obliged to act. Another limit is connected to emotional coloring. Weakening habitual defenses can temporarily lead to a feeling of vulnerability. This is a normal phase of change and requires the support of discipline and kindness. Kindness, as the background of practice, helps to guide openness so that it does not destroy social structures or personal care for close ones. Haku and Ekaku showed that enlightenment manifests in compassion, and this remains a relevant criterion for the correct application of the experience of emptiness. Social checking remains critical. Emptiness experienced individually acquires meaning only through interaction. If you isolate yourself and use the state as an excuse to shirk responsibilities, the meaning degrades. Nagarjuna emphasized interdependence as a way to recognize and remove such erroneous applications. A teacher and the community help to spot blind spots and provide mirror-like feedback that keeps the practice honest. The next limit is psychophysiological. Unbinding rigid patterns requires time and bodily stamina. Sharp attempts to accelerate the process through extreme practices can cause dissociation or tension. Practice must preserve gradualness and respect for the body. Dogen Daiken noted discipline as an integral part of the path, and this appears in skillful alternation of effort and rest, in regularly returning to the support of the breath, and in attention to ordinary duties. In the end, emptiness as an experienced reality works when it becomes an instrument for more precise participation in life. The particular case described at the beginning turns out to be an indicator of deep changes if it repeats and is confirmed by impact on others. The general model explains how knots of attachment dissolve and how the body becomes the means of verification. The limitations point to the need for ethics, discipline, support, and caution about ideologizing. Trust the field of sensation, check consequences in deeds, and keep kindness as a constant background. Then, the experience of emptiness will remain a living support in your practice. The rule is simple and strict at the same time. No mind is a state of action in which inner commentary and evaluation are absent, not an emptiness as the absence of life. In it, action arises directly from the organ of perception and the body. Attention is directed at what is happening, and thought does not interfere with the process of guiding movement, speech, and decision. This rule functions as a practice criterion. If the inner verbal stream does not govern your movements, this is already a manifestation of no mind. It does not require you to stop thinking forever. The single demand is to give the body and the moment the possibility to respond without constant off-stage explanation. Tension in this rule is always present. Thought performs many functions: coordination, planning, predicting consequences, storing biographical context. An attempt to follow the rule without support from gradual integration leads to conflicts between the body's reactions and habitual inner speech. When the inner commentator loses its usual role, it becomes insistent, like a voice demanding explanations and confirmations. This provokes internal tension, a search for explanations, attempts to measure the state and fix it in the intellect. Inner protest manifests as doubt, anxiety, the desire to prove to oneself and others that progress has occurred. There are also real risks associated with hasty practice. Detachment from commentary sometimes shifts into a breakdown of bonds with context. In extreme attempts to reach no mind, a split occurs between the automatic functioning of the body and the fullness of self-reflection. This state can mimic an authentic experience, but be accompanied by a loss of sense of responsibility or a loss of nuance in relating to others. Emotions that were previously filtered by thought come out without mediators. Vulnerability increases, and in the absence of reliable support of discipline and community, this can lead to dangerous actions driven by raw impulsivity. Psychophysiological boundaries here are important. The nervous system requires time to reorganize, and abrupt changes often turn out to be destabilizing. Another tension comes from the intellect, which tends to turn a method into a personal label. The inner voice can fixate the state as an achievement, create a new image of I who am free from thoughts, and turn practice into an object of pride. This is a substitution of essence. Instead of living presence, a ritual of self-knowledge for self-identification appears. Social consequences show up when a practitioner uses no mind as an excuse to shirk duties or to behave abruptly without regard for others' feelings. In these moments, practice needs to be checked through honest feedback from those around and through attentive observation of the action's impact on others. Practical tension requires tightening discipline. It is useful here to recall instructions of the masters who combine directness with a demand for bodily endurance. Dogen Daiken drew attention to the fact that the practice of sitting in everyday action must go hand in hand. Without bodily support, no mind becomes empty and loses its living connection to work. Hakuin Ekaku emphasized that the sincerity of experience manifests in compassion and the laborious application of attention. Nagarjuna pointed to the interdependence of phenomena as a way to hold the experience from becoming an autonomous idea. These voices help to orient. No mind requires not only renunciation of inner commentary, but also rooting in ethics, bodily technique, and communication. Resolving tension is built on 3 supporting lines. The first line is gradualness and bodily practice. Start with short periods of action where attention is directed at the next nearest step. At that moment, keep the criterion, absence of inner commentary, not emptiness, as the goal.
it is important that the body remain engaged and respond adequately. The second line is checking by influence. Evaluate each action by whether it makes other people more free and whether it becomes easier for them to interact with you. If your presence reduces suffering and creates space for others, that is evidence of authenticity. The third line is support from a teacher or community who can point out blind spots and give an honest mirror. Methodical steps can be formalized as a sequence of simple settings. First, put forward an intention to act honestly and give priority to immediate perception. Then rely on the breath and the weight of the body as anchors that do not require thought's control. Next, practice short periods of work where the task is to perform an action without commenting on it internally. After repetitions, return to check-in results. What are the consequences for those around you and for yourself? Accompany all stages with gentle kindness towards yourself. This kindness protects against harsh demands for the absence of thought and serves as a base for sustained endurance. Criteria of authenticity of no mind are simple and strict. The first sign is a clear ability to respond instantly to a situation, without delay caused by internal discussion. The second is the absence of self-enhancement through the state. If the experience is not used as confirmation of one's importance, it remains alive. The third criterion is the ethical orientation of actions. They ease others' lives rather than complicate them. These indicators are measured not abstractly, but in concrete responses of life, at work, in communication, in caring for those nearby. Maintaining balance requires constant discipline and self-investigation. Practice no mind in areas where the body and attention are already sufficiently prepared, and do not move into zones where considered restraint is required. Pay attention to the nervous system and to emotional reactions. If bewilderment arises, return to simpler forms of support. A teacher's advice and honest dialogue with the community preserve the practice from distortion and personal fixation. It is precisely the combination of sincere kindness, bodily technique, and social checking that turns no mind into a stable skill. It is important to remember in the end that no mind is a discipline, not an escape technique. It requires training, courage, and ethical sensitivity. When the tension between body and thought is resolved through sequential practice, action becomes clear and light, and life more open and responsible. You can begin with small steps, upholding the rule and applying the criteria. Maintaining kindness and seeking honest feedback will turn the state from a random phenomenon into a sustained capacity to be present without unnecessary commentary. Beginner's mind is the lightness of perception, an open readiness to take something as if meeting it for the first time. Experience often solidifies forms and makes the world predictable. This contrast sets the tone. Openness does not arise by itself. It is sustained by training and intention. Openness manifests as direct attention to phenomena without automatic labels. When you encounter a smell, a sound, or a thought, beginner's mind allows these elements to appear on their own without fitting them into prearranged categories. In this presence, the liveliness of perception is preserved, and each moment provides new information that can be used for action or simply experienced. It is important that openness does not mean carelessness. It requires endurance and bodily steadiness, because sustained attention is supported by the breath and by grounding in the body. Why openness is so valued in Zen? It remains a criterion of genuine contact with the present. Awakening begins where habitual reading of the world ceases. Dogen Daiken repeatedly returns to the idea of constant practice in which even a familiar action retains freshness when performed with attention. Hakui Nakaku
emphasizes the necessity of sincerity and directness, which become possible inside a mind unburdened by prejudiced expectations. Shunryu Suzuki offers a simple thought. A student should remain a student even when having experience, because only openness keeps the bridge to new insights. The practice of cultivating a beginner's mind relies on bodily anchors and rituals that return attention to the beginning. Sitting, simple observation of the breath, and repetition of precise techniques of action keep the mind within the bounds of receptivity. This is not a race for the sensation of youth. It is a discipline of a kind of perpetual first step. Support from a teacher and community plays an essential role here. A mirror that reflects closeness or complacency helps to preserve the initial position of openness. Internal obstacles are subtle and insidious. The intellect tends to exploit new states, turning them into knowledge, into a set of techniques. In this process, openness becomes an object of pride and loses its simple function, to meet. Nagarjuna pointed to the connection of cognition and attachment. A mind that fixes experience as a thing of its own significance ceases to be the primary channel of perception. Preserving the softness of mind requires constant self-investigation and the willingness to allow that even what seems mastered can again be new. The ethical side of the beginner's mind is inseparable from the practice. Openness makes possible listening to another person and a genuine response to their needs, because to hear means to free space for another's voice, not to drown it with prior categories. Agreements and professionalism are not cancelled by this. On the contrary, skill makes possible presence without automatic reaction. This combination of clarity and goodwill elevates openness above mere curiosity. The body remains the primary test of authenticity. If attention is alive, movements flow naturally, not constrained by schemes. You can practice beginner's mind in short stretches. Consciously approach a task without a script. Observe how the quality of action and its consequences change. Here, the criterion is not a romantic idea of ignorance, but the ability to act clearly, responsively, and responsibly. Hakui Nekaku and Dogen Daikin both emphasize that true mastery and beginning go together. The master still remains a student of the moment. Openness has boundaries that must be respected. There are tasks that require foresight, accumulated skill, and mental discipline. In such situations, openness does not cancel planning and responsibility. It enriches them by allowing plan correction in light of new perception. If the need for preparation is ignored, openness becomes superficial and can cause harm. Therefore, the combination of skill support and freshness of attention is the key to a mature application of the beginner's mind. The path of maintaining openness passes through regular return to the start, through acceptance of incompletion, and through honest feedback from others. A teacher in a practice circle gives signals about when the mind closes over its own achievements and help to recognize signs of tightness. Personal kindness to oneself in this process serves as an antidote to self-criticism and pretensions that easily replace sincere striving for insight. Consolidation of the beginner's mind is expressed in 3 points. First, readiness to meet each moment without affixing familiar labels. Second, application of openness in service to others, where hearing and action are proportionate to someone's needs. Third, discipline of bodily grounding, which prevents openness from dissolving into distraction. When all 3 lines work together, beginner's mind does not remain an idea.
it becomes a practical quality of life. The final thought is simple and down to earth. Beginner's openness is not a utopian return to infancy, but a mature ability to begin again constantly. You can accustom yourself to this step by combining attention with responsibility and support from a teacher or community. Then every morning, every action, and every word will retain the freshness of meeting and become an entryway into a more honest and clear presence. Non-attachment to the fruits of action is a moral and practical attitude in which the result does not determine the value of the action itself. You act with clear intention, invest attention and care, and at the same time do not depend on external return as a criterion of personal significance. Explaining this stance requires attention to motive. Intention remains an inner compass. If it is honest, the action serves. Non-attachment does not weaken effort. It frees it from personal expectation. In this freedom, a clarity of choice appears. You see what makes the action useful here and now, not only in terms of prospective reward. Such an approach restructures the habitual economy of motivation. The place of expectations is taken by concern for the quality of work and for how it fits into the lives of others. Acting this way, you preserve energy for the next step, because emotional swings from outcomes will not tear you apart. Practice of non-attachment involves the body and routine. Breath, even posture, and the sequence of movements provide the support that minimizes emotional dependence on outcome. When the fingers learn to work without inner tension for recognition, skill grows. In working with people, non-attachment manifests as the ability to listen without queuing for a specific answer, in willingness to offer help for the sake of support rather than to keep score of merits. This strengthens responsibility through liberation from egocentric demands for reciprocation. The internal mechanism is simple. Motive sets direction, action is performed with attention, the result is accepted as a fact, not as an evaluation of personality. Consequences require honest analysis, but they do not become a measure of your worth. Such organization of the psyche reduces the tendency to devalue yourself after an unfavorable outcome and to self-glorify upon success. Practically, this means you can correct course without drama, learn and return to work without a sense of lost meaning. Sometimes the question arises about long-term motivation. How to sustain effort if reward is not the incentive? The answer is in regularly returning to the primary motive and in renewing the understanding of the meaning of the work. Collective meaning, responsibility to specific people, and care in execution provide steady nourishment. Support from a practice circle or colleagues serves as an external frame that helps endure periods when internal motivation temporarily weakens. A small example: if you help a colleague finish a project and the result advances someone else, the contribution remains meaningful when the help was thoughtfully given and done with attention. You register the quality of the action, not the final marker of success. The boundary of this stance is expressed clearly. Non-attachment does not remove responsibility for consequences. In accepting results calmly, you must also accept their ethics. If an action caused harm, non-attachment is not a justification for failing to remedy the situation. Flexibility is required. Remain free from dependence on outcome while simultaneously taking responsibility for what occurred. This boundary makes non-attachment a mature practice, not an evasion of consequences. Another boundary is personal honesty. Non-attachment does not serve as a cover for passivity or for masking selfish motives under the guise of selflessness. Authenticity of motive is verified in bodily and emotional honesty. When you act, your inner state should correspond with your words. Here, the importance of bodily discipline returns, which helps to notice if motivation has transformed into a hidden hope. The connection to the Zen tradition is expressed in the constant emphasis on the moment of action and on intention as an inner discipline. Dogen Daikin described practice as the simultaneous manifestation of sitting and everyday life, where each task is already practice. Dogen Daikin noted that enlightenment manifests in activity, when action is free from clinging to the fruit. Haku Nekaku emphasized sincerity of motive as the core of spiritual life, where purity of intention is more important than external resonance. Shunryu Suzuki said that the student should perform their work with full presence, not expecting special praise. This attachment to the masters does not turn the idea into a dogma. It shows that non-attachment is not abstract asceticism, but a technique of mature presence. By practicing it, you train attention so that morning decisions and small deeds retain meaning regardless of the mirrored reflection of outcomes. This is the deep ethics, to act from clarity and care, not from dependence on recognition. The practical plan is simple. In the morning, set aside 5 minutes to tune, breathing, focusing on intention, a brief note on why you are undertaking this day. During the day, mark moments when emotions take over and return to the breath and the purpose. In team meetings, talk about process, not only metrics. This fosters a culture where effort is valued for itself. It is also important to celebrate small steps and give feedback that recognizes effort and growth, not only results. Sometimes you must be able to step back. If a project causes harm or consumes resources without apparent benefit, an honest refusal is also an action with a clear motive. This is not indulgence of one's weaknesses, but a discipline of choice. To spend energy where it creates good, and to accept that not everything is under your control. Practice, like any skill, grows through repetition and honest feedback. Ask for help, share doubts, and analyze results without self-blame. This way, you cultivate collective wisdom and personal resilience. Over time, non-attachment ceases to be a task and becomes a natural tone of character. You keep warmth toward people and a cool calculation toward outcomes that do not always depend on you. Non-attachment is a skill that requires time, honesty, and an environment that supports growth. Cherish it, and it will sustain you in labors where meaning matters more than reward. Start small. One honest action today is a contribution to forming a habit leading to freedom and care. Forever. The problem is clear and painful. Many seek in a teacher confirmation of their rightness, ready-made recipes, or gentle consolation. The teacher becomes a mirror that reflects not a state of mind, but the student's project, expectations, fears, hopes. In such a mirror, the image blurs. Relationships become a theater where the main thing is the correct expression and the right words, not a genuine test of body and heart. When the search for confirmation matters more than inner honesty, the practice slows and sometimes stops altogether. The criterion of an authentic mirror is simple and concrete. Look at 3 things. How much the session with the teacher exposes habitual automatisms. How much the teacher prompts you to respond with your own body and attention, rather than repeat what you've heard. How much clarity, not dependence on evaluation, remains after the meeting. If the teacher's presence produces a noticeable change in your breathing, your posture, the tone of your thoughts, if you are more honest with yourself, then the mirror is working. The second criterion is immediacy.
Mirrored feedback arrives in the moment of action, not delayed into discussion. The third criterion is responsibility. A teacher who mirrors returns your choice to you as something to be corrected, not as an occasion for excuses. The consequences of working with a true mirror are deep and twofold in quality. On one hand, recognition of your patterns accelerates. Anxiety, pride, the craving for praise become visible like stains on a surface. This gives the chance to correct in real time, to change a gesture, tone of voice, or way of thinking. Such an experience is like a sudden light that reveals details where before they were only general shadows. A sharp look can cause a painful shift, but it clears the field for the next step. On the other hand, mirroring fosters maturity. Students learn to take responsibility, develop the ability to distinguish sincere intention from ritual repetition, and learn to live so that action aligns with consciousness. The mirror's influence is felt in the group as well. When several people undergo honest reflection, a culture of mutual checking forms. Words begin to be valued less than consistency of actions, and this changes the atmosphere of work. In such an environment, the standard of ethics rises, and the space for hypocrisy shrinks. The maturity of practice becomes visible not as loud achievements, but as steadiness in simple things. Arriving on time, the ability to listen, care for the consequences of one's deeds. In this sense, the word teacher ceases to be a title and becomes a function in the field of practice. But there are negative consequences if the mirror is distorted. When a teacher reflects projections for the sake of power or status, students consolidate fantasies about themselves instead of breaking them down. Dependency appears, masked by devotion. Criticism takes the form of loyalty, and growth is replaced by rhetoric of success. In such cases, the community pays with trust and inner honesty. History shows that authority without constant self-reflection easily turns into abuse. Hakuin Nakaku used a harsh technique of shaking the mind because he believed only a direct challenge could destroy illusions. His methods demanded strict discipline and clear ethics. Otherwise, they turned into wounding rather than healing. The boundary of this practice must be clear and uncompromising. The mirror does not replace daily work. It requires readiness for examination and correction. The teacher does not pronounce verdicts for the student and does not do the practice for them. The duty to practice remains with the one who comes to the mirror. The ethics of relationships requires openness to responsibility and readiness for consequences. Shunryu Suzuki emphasized simple work as an indicator of mind. If meeting the teacher does not lead to change in ordinary actions, then talk of a mirror is premature. There are organizational and personal guarantees that minimize risk and strengthen the mirror's effectiveness. Transparency of teachers' methods, regular community review of mentors, the possibility of feedback, discussion of boundaries and responsibilities, continual work by the teacher on their own state. These measures provide a stable foundation and help avoid turning the mirror into an instrument of power. Dogen Daiken pointed to the importance of face-to-face as a form of transmission. But face-to-face must be accompanied by a process of responsible accompaniment, not only symbolic ritual. When you encounter a reflection, ask yourself what exactly resonates in you. Pride, fear, the desire to be liked. Look at your reaction as content of the mirror. Authentic mirroring reveals where correction is needed
and offers a space for correction through action. Accept the reflection not as a sentence, but as an indication of the work you have to do. Such an attitude preserves respect for the teacher and asserts your autonomy in the practice. From this boundary grows a simple obligation. Check how the reflection changes your everyday life. If formal rituals and praise do not lead to inner change, seek honesty in practice, not confirmation in words. Linji Yishuan noted that the strength of a teaching is measured by how it withstands ordinary affairs, and this remains a useful test. The mirror should help you become someone who acts with clarity and honesty, without looking to recognition ratings. It is in this combination of challenge and support that the teacher's authentic role in the Zen tradition appears. The practice of everyday life is arranged as a transitional mechanism that links formal sitting with the whole flow of life. It becomes a habit to return attention to the body and breath in the moment of ordinary tasks, and through repetition, this return ceases to be an effort and turns into an automatic orienting point. The body stores the mind's posture, the way you hold your back, the tone of the voice, the pace of movements create a lasting biography of attention. Each deed bears the imprint of previous practice, and when these imprints accumulate, they form a field in which choice becomes less dependent on emotional impulses and more on clarity of presence. The mechanism relies on three interrelated supports: a simple inward shift of focus at the start of an action, a brief check of intention before acting, and a return to sensation after completion. These processes are short in time, but repeated many times, they rewire neural pathways and form a lifestyle that supports an awakened mind. Why this is necessary is not an abstract question, but a purely practical one. When practice is limited to the cushion, the experience of awakening remains localized, and there is a risk of it turning into an ideological belonging. Life, however, is constant entries and exits, conversations, work, care for loved ones, decisions under fatigue and irritation. The practice of everyday life places the test right in these places. It serves as a criterion of the validity of experience, because a true shift shows in how you react to small irritation, how purely you perform routine work, how you respond to a request for help. When everyday life becomes a continuation of sitting, the division between special spiritual time and the rest of time disappears. This reduces the temptation to seek confirmation only in rituals and allows you to know whether the inner transformation works in what really matters. Dogen Daiken emphasized the importance of daily work as practice, and the sense of that idea is simple. If enlightenment does not withstand the test of ordinary duties, its benefit remains nominal. Where the mechanism breaks is a question that requires an honest look. The first type of breakage is formalization of returning attention into routine. Repeating actions without awareness produces a ritual that only imitates presence. Then habits look like habits, not doors to clarity. The second type is the rupture between intention and body. The desire to act from clarity remains at the level of words, while the body responds with old patterns. The third break is tied to the idea of result. Practice becomes a means to achieve status or inner comfort, and then every action is performed with calculation for the fruit. Another breakdown arises in the community. If external correctness and evaluation prevail in the group, rather than checking action, everyday practice degrades into display. Hakuin Nekaku reminded of the risk of harshly shaking the mind without an ethical support. Similarly, when everyday gestures are theoretically shaken rather than truly lived, that wounds rather than supports. Organizational factors also matter. Unspoken duties, lack of feedback, division of roles so that some talk about practice while others live it. All this contributes to dissociation. The collapse of the mechanism manifests in subtle symptoms that can be learned to recognize. You may notice you got up on time and cheerfully recited your practices, but in the evening you are angry over a trifle. Or you may give special importance to external rituals while avoiding the hard work that requires compassion and responsibility. Often, speech begins to claim the place of action. Discussion of intentions replaces real testing in action. When these signs appear, it is important to pay attention not to judgment, but to restore the links between attention, body, and task. Shunryu Suzuki spoke of simple work as an indicator of mind. This simplicity is not impoverishment, but clarification of a process where action and presence coincide. The conclusion from all this is unequivocal and practical. The practice of everyday life must be arranged as the nearest tool for checking and correcting the mind. Start small. Make an agreement with yourself about a short check of intention before the most ordinary task, and the return of attention immediately after its completion. Gradually increase the number of such insertions until they become the natural link between sitting and life. Honest assessment is important. Look not at pretty reports or the intensity of rhetoric, but at the quality of actions in everyday conditions. How you hold yourself in fatigue, in conflict, in routine work. Linji Yishan noted that the strength of a teaching is measured in the load of everydayness, and this remains a useful orientation. Community support is critical. Agreements on sharing care, honest feedback, and recognition of small changes strengthen the integration mechanism. Everyday practice requires discipline without constriction. Discipline here is the habit of returning to contact with the body, not a strict scale of achievements. Create conditions in which body and attention meet more often. Simple habits, regular breaks to check back in breathing, work with hands that helps the body remember presence. If it seems to you that this becomes routine, ask what inside you is dry or thirsting for approval. A tactic of small steps protects against overload and the temptation to dramatize practice. I have seen how the constancy of small checks builds inner honesty where loud practices fail. The supporting role of teacher and community in this integration is not symbolic. A teacher can point out discrepancies between word and deed, help limit practices, and return attention to simple tasks. At the same time, responsibility remains with the practitioner. No one can live your life for you. Dogen Daiken and Shunryu Suzuki reminded of the importance of sitting and work. And the point of their instructions is that enlightenment is grounded in everyday life, not only in rare experiences. When every task is perceived as a continuation of sitting, you create a field in which clarity and compassion become the mind's autopilot. This is not magic, but the effect of constant choice, punctual returns, and honest testing in daily life. If you are ready to adopt this approach, start with one action and hold it as a test. Let it be your beacon. Return to the breath, check intention, and notice the result in the next minute. Over time, small changes will accumulate into a way of life that confirms that sitting and moving are one whole. How does spontaneity turn into mastery when every action feels simple and natural, and there is no longer inner struggle in it? Spontaneity in Zen is not an explosion of impulse, but the result of long work on attention and the body. It is a state in which responding is precise, appropriate, and easy, because it stores the memory of previous choices. Mastery appears as a quality of movement of mind and body that does not require constant self-control. The body remembers. Attention gently supports this remembered order. Intention serves as a quiet orienting point, not a loud injunction. It is exactly this integration that makes spontaneity mature and responsible. The mechanism of turning habit into mastery is simple in structure and difficult in execution. Repetition with presence paves the way in the nervous system, but the key element is presence within repetition. When each action is accompanied by a brief check of intention and a sense of bodily contact, a bodily memory forms that surfaces itself under load. Sitting practice, body technique, and regular checks become the ground where automatic reactions cease to be blind. Shunryu Suzuki pointed to the power of simple returns of attention as a way to make presence constant rather than episodic. The short conclusion can be expressed thus. Mastery is born where repetition is combined with attention. Without attention, repetition remains mechanics. Much of the work lies in the body. Postures, breathing, tempo of movements, and the strength of the voice become means of storing the mind. With sustained practice, they synchronize with intention and the environment. Then action begins to come as a response, not as a choice among options. Dogen Daiken emphasized that practice and manifestation are one whole, and this manifestation is visible in how a person lifts a cup of tea, how they look at an interlocutor, how they put a tool away after work. The ethical aspect of spontaneity is inseparable from its aesthetics. Spontaneity devoid of care for others turns into a habit useful only to its owner. A masterful action contains a moment of compassion and precision. Linji Yixuan spoke of discernment that does not separate itself from the world. Such discernment shows itself in simple deeds and withstands the test of fatigue and irritation. When habit becomes an expression of care, it no longer substitutes presence with show. The analytical picture of the process looks like this. Cause, regular practice including attention to the body and checking intention. Structure, formation of bodily memory and a skill that triggers in response to specific external and internal signals. Consequences, stability of behavior under stress, conservation of internal energy, and the ability to act with clarity and care. The boundary of this process is seen by the reaction under pressure. If action remains true to its principles, mastery is achieved. If the reaction breaks, a return to basics is required. There are subtle traps on this path. Automatism that preserves form without living presence creates habits resembling skill but lacking maturity. Public admiration of mastery can stimulate performance for spectators. Inner tension and struggle for the sake of results substitute for true ease, turning movement into spectacle. Hakui Nakaku noted that shaking the mind must be accompanied by an ethical inclination. Otherwise, the energy remains painfully torn. Watching motivation is not a technical whim, but a way to preserve the good nature of the produced automatism. The role of a mentor in community is to show the desynchronization of word and deed. The teacher helps reveal where the mechanism works formally, where the body still responds with old patterns, where compromise is made for convenience. My experience and Shunryu Suzuki's words confirm, external correction accelerates integration, and honest feedback makes the process transparent. Responsibility, however, remains with the practitioner, because mastery is the personal share of repetition and attention. Practical steps are simple and concrete. Start by choosing one daily action and give it a special attitude. A light breath check before beginning, a brief setting of intention, and a short contact with bodily sensations after finishing. Repeat this for a long time with gentle persistence. Over time, automatism will arise from clarity, not from memory of rules. Dogen Daiken and Linji Yixuan reminded that enlightenment is confirmed in the ordinary. A sequence of small acts forms that very spontaneity that is trusted. The boundary is clear and practical. Spontaneity becomes mastery, where repetition meets honesty of motivation and bodily attentiveness. It is a process that requires time and community, and in which every action is both an exam and a confirmation. If you return to this exam every day, mastery will eventually show itself in life itself, not in words about it. Practice requires patience and gentleness.
Do not rush to judgments, and do not await a bright breakthrough. Change is more often come as a gradual clearing of habits and the revival of feelings. Important is not only technique, but the ability to observe your own motivations without condemnation. Each morning, returning to a simple action, remind yourself why you began, not for praise, but for clarity and care. Over time, you will notice that decisions become easier and relationships deeper. Mastery does not detach you from life. It returns you to life with greater honesty. Let this returnability be your compass. One small act of presence next to another, one kind choice after another. Thus, spontaneity, built on attention and ethics, becomes an irrefutable part of your day. Continue the practice with gentle resolve, allowing mistakes to be teachers. Remember that the sincerity of intention gives depth to each repetition and makes spontaneity truly responsible. Let the path be simple. Attend, do, return, constantly. When scriptures become pointers, the consequence is visible in that the verification of truth shifts into the body and the moment. The text ceases to act as a guarantee and becomes a suggestive backdrop to which you return after experience. As a result, responsibility for meaning shifts to the practitioner, not to the author of the line, but to the one who tests it in the breath, in the posture, and in the deed. This makes the path both livelier and stricter at the same time, because a pointer is powerless where contact with the present has not arisen. The reason for this shift lies in the very nature of words. Words fix form and the general course of thought. They simplify and classify. This is useful when a landmark is needed. It is unsatisfactory when direct contact is required. The mechanism is simple. The text organizes attention around an idea, but the idea must pass through the body, glide along the muscles, and return as a felt clarity. The social and psychological effect amplifies this mechanism. People tend to seek certainty in authority. When authority is overvalued, attention stops at the quotation rather than at how it works in the breath. Shunryu Suzuki warned that words must be accompanied by a return of attention to practice, otherwise they remain a decorative shell. A clarification is needed regarding the usefulness of texts. Scripture fulfills three practical functions. It shows the direction, preserves the line of transmission, and offers exercises for verification. Text is convenient as a map of the route, but the map does not replace traveling through the country. One short example. Read a few lines before sitting, then observe how the body changes in the posture. Make a note of the difference between the idea and the living sensation. This simple check turns a word into an experience. How to distinguish a living pointer from an empty quotation? A simple and important question. I will answer like this. A living pointer prompts a concrete action and brings a change in the next action. If you read a phrase and were able to approach a cup of tea differently, speak more calmly, or stop before anger, then the text has entered the body. If reading only produces a mentally approving smile and the desire to recite the sentence closer to others, then the pointer has remained on the surface. Dogen Daiken emphasized that the meaning of a text is confirmed in the deed itself, in how a person returns to ordinary affairs with different attention. An image will help catch the subtle difference.
Text is like a compass. It shows the direction north, the landmark. It does not move the feet. When the compass is mixed with the road, contact with the terrain is lost. The consequence of this? Relying only on a book, it is easy to lose the ability to hear current conditions. Hakuin Nekaku emphasized that true transmission passes through a jolt of the mind, through an action that does not copy the line, but lives it through with full bodily and intentional engagement. The boundaries of interaction with writings are clear and manageable. A text is useful as long as it serves as a tool for verification and does not become an excuse. Danger arises when a quotation takes on the function of replacing experience and stops requiring your daily checking of motivation. Literary beauty can support the illusion of understanding. Linji Yixuan noted that listening without verification is hearing for the sake of hearing. True listening pours into action. The practice of aligning word and deed requires simple habits. You can choose 3 regular gestures. Read a short paragraph before practice. Apply it in one specific action during the day. Write down one observation about the difference between idea and experience. These steps will help turn the text into a working tool. I have seen how such a sequence transforms the relationship to scripture. It ceases to be an excuse and becomes the backbone of bodily integrity. Attachment to tradition and authors is needed to understand where the value of a pointer lies. Dogen Daiken shifted the emphasis to the idea that writing is the pulse of practice, not its completion. Shunryu Suzuki insisted on the constant return of attention to the body after reading, so that the word does not remain theory. Haku Nekaku require that the word provoke a jolt that is then tested in life. These examples show the same thing. Writing does not guarantee awakening. It shows a path for one who is ready to take steps. If you take a text as an occasion for daily verification, you will become a friend in the work, not an ornament on a shelf. The path to bodily truth is not a contest in knowledge of quotations, but a discipline of returns. Each return is a small experiment. You read, apply, observe, correct. After a month of such cyclic checking, the text ceases to be an external crutch and becomes information embedded in movements. You notice that you sit more upright, speak more slowly, listen more attentively. It is important not to expect miracles from the word. It should not solve the problem for you, but it can become a mirror in which your intention and habit are visible. When you practice systematically, new questions arise. Where and how does the word cease to correspond to experience? Which metaphors mislead? Which formulations help awakening? A leader or practice companion can accelerate this analysis. Discussion does not replace verification, but deepens it, because it gives the opportunity to hear other reactions and compare bodily responses. A teacher, at best, points out discrepancies and offers additional exercises, but does not impose an interpretation. There is also an ethical side. Text can serve as justification for harshness or complacency if used as a shield. The practitioner's responsibility is to recognize any use of writing for self-justification. A quotation presented as a shield loses the status of a pointer and becomes a mechanism of escape from the present. The antidote is simple: honest reporting to oneself and to a small practice group where the visibility of intentions is easier to preserve. Finally, it is worth remembering: writing is part of a living tradition, but not its limit. It supports and guides as long as living power is heard in it. As soon as a text becomes defensive, it needs to be reconsidered, replaced, or returned to simple observation without words. This path is about constant verification, about returns, and about the courage to share responsibility for meaning between the line and the body. And that's all. Once I observed how a person who came to practice with a firm intention to understand Zen began to correct a small thing in the body. He slightly tilted his chin, changed the angle of his shoulders, and allowed the breath to descend lower. After a few weeks, the habit became automatic. What had previously remained a matter of intellect, a question about the meaning of practice, became obvious in sensations. Fatigue left earlier. Irritation did not flare up so quickly. Decisions were made without prolonged internal discussion. This particular case shows exactly how bodily discipline turns an abstract idea into immediate contact. The conclusion from this is simple. Discipline and body technique work as a bridge between knowledge and intuition. Practice technology forms a structure of attention. When posture, breath, and gestures are refined by repetition, the mind gains a support it can lean on outside of words. The body preserves a trace that the mind later reads as clarity. It is this repeatable clarity that turns a random flash into a stable capacity, an intuitive sensitivity in action. One might ask, why does bodily repetition have such power if an insight seems like a sudden flash? Analysis shows that the immediacy of insight is not accidental. Long work with muscular patterns, attention to the boundary of inhalation and exhalation, the rhythm of sitting, creates an internal density where predispositions to recognition arise. These predispositions are not visible in reasoning. They manifest at the point of decision. The mechanism is simple. The body stores the correspondence between stimulus and response. Neural networks and muscular habits form the path of least resistance along which attention flows. Intuition is not a mystical gift, but the result of a certain ordering of the bodily field. A generalization invests this notion with a broader thought. Discipline, as an order of movement and breath, becomes a form of thinking without a verbal tag. It overturns the idea that knowledge is always accompanied by words. Dogen Daiken drew attention to the fact that practice is the body's writing. Shunryu Suzuki spoke of returning to the support of the breath after reading. Hakuin Ekaku insisted that technique provoke a jolt that is then tested in actions. These thoughts show a common line. Bodily discipline creates an environment in which intuition develops lawfully as a result of persistent training. The meaning of this position is revealed in three interconnected elements: discipline, sensitivity, and readiness to improvise. Discipline sets the form of practice. Sensitivity fills it with content. Readiness allows one to respond creatively in the concrete moment. Listing them helps to see that technique is not an end in itself. It is a tool for cultivating a subtle way of responding. When all three elements are present, actions cease to be habitual reactions and become responses arising from the clarity of presence. It is important to state the limitation of this route directly. Discipline can become a rigid form if its goal is lost in repetition. A body accustomed to one scheme stops noticing changes, and then automatism suppresses living flexibility. In this field, caution is appropriate. The rhythm of practice should include periods of inquiry when fixed techniques are questioned through attention. The line between stability and rigidity is not always noticeable. It needs to be maintained by observation and correction. Another limit is connected with faith in technique as a universal means. Bodily discipline gives a key to intuition within the context of a particular practice culture and a particular body. What works for one person is not reproducible as a formula for all. The system is limited by individual anatomy and a history of habits. This means the method requires adaptation, and adaptation requires honest reporting of results. Shunryu Suzuki noted that returning to the body after reading is a personal check, and no general rule will replace it. A practical recommendation follows from these limits. Shape discipline as a series of variable exercises. A stable posture, breathing with varying depth, short periods of movement. Such a set helps preserve order and at the same time train flexibility. I have seen how changing one element, for example the rhythm of the exhale, opened a new access to clarity. This is simply a way to keep practice alive and adaptive. The ethical dimension is also present. Discipline turned into proof of one's own valor loses its aim. Technique in this case serves self-affirmation rather than the disclosure of sincerity. Distinguishing the aspiration to mastery from the search for external confirmation is important for preserving the authenticity of the path. Linji Yishan emphasized attention to motivation. Pure discipline is nourished by curiosity, not by the desire to surpass others. Returning to the mechanics of the process, I will lay it out differently, briefly. Repetition forms a channel. The channel simplifies choice. Simplification frees attention for perceiving the subtle. This analytical breakdown applies to practice again and again, but its usefulness is limited by the fact that it itself remains a thought. Rechecking through the body is required. Dogen Daiken called this the correspondence between word and deed. Keeping that correspondence turns technique into a source of intuitive knowledge. In conclusion, I will emphasize that discipline and bodily technique are not a magical door that opens understanding once and for all. Their power is that they create conditions for thinking free from constant verbal control. If you work with the body consistently and attentively, intuition ceases to be accidental and becomes a reliable resource. At the same time, keep practice alive. Introduce changes, check sensations, preserve honesty of motivation. Then the bridge from discipline to intuition will remain strong and full of life. The rule is simple and at the same time profoundly striking. Everything in the experience of an awakened mind is interdependent. There is no separate entity that lives independently of conditions. This law is not only about the world as a network of causes and conditions, it is about how consciousness manifests in each moment. When the mind is awake, objects, feelings, thoughts, and actions appear as co-phenomena. They are born together and die together. Such a view changes the way one perceives oneself and others, because pre-drawn boundaries disappear, and what remains is a working flow of relations. Tension arises from several sources. The first is the cognitive and emotional sense of diffusion. If everything is interconnected, where is your responsibility? If there is no separate center, how maintain the clarity of choice? The second tension is connected to the habitual need for firm supports. A world based on conditionality offers few comforting points to cling to forever. The third tension is the danger of idealizing interdependence as an excuse for inaction. Seeing connections does not automatically mean knowing how to act in a concrete situation. These tensions show up as doubt, as a tendency to get stuck in reflection rather than move to response. Another side of the tension is practical. Interdependence includes health, economy, culture, habits of mind and body. When these layers overlap, the action of one element produces a chain of changes. This fact creates weight. Any intervention can lead to unwanted consequences. Fear of causing harm arises. Fear of making the wrong choice. And this fear can paralyze. The very idea of interdependence, taken to an absolute, can become a dogma where structural analysis replaces living contact with the moment. In this context, a discipline of mind is important, one that holds clarity without dissolving it into abstraction. Historical voices confirm and refine this rule, each in their own way. Dogen and Daikin emphasize that form and emptiness mutually permeate one another in sitting. The very act of practice is an expression of connection with the conditions of time and place. Haku Inakaku pointed out that awakening manifests in daily affairs, where each movement depends on previous ones and influences subsequent ones. Shunryu Suzuki brought attention back to simple breathing as the place where the neighborhood of mind and body is revealed. Linji Yixuan stressed direct contact with sensations as a way to recognize the co-arising of all phenomena. These names are embedded in the tradition not for authority's sake, but to show how the idea of interdependence is verified in the practice and words of those who worked with it most intensively. To ease the tension, it is useful to recognize three key properties of interdependence: conditionality, openness, and responsibility. Conditionality means that phenomena arise given a certain set of causes and conditions. Openness emphasizes that these conditions are always changing and admit intervention. Responsibility reminds that participation in the system requires careful attention to consequences. Analytically, it looks like this. Cause forms the field. The field organizes the response. The response alters the cause. Such a circle is not vicious, it is functional. It explains why action in the present moment has the power to change tomorrow. This analysis helps settle anxiety because it makes the situation manageable. To understand the structure is to find points of application for effort. A practical solution requires an image of working with attention.
Act through 4 steps. Stop the automatic passing of thoughts and feelings to notice the network of conditions. Trace the roots of the reaction for several breaths. Introduce an intention that takes the nearest consequences into account. Check the result in the next act of attention. These steps serve not as a formula, but as an exercise in linking understanding with action. If you regularly check the impact of your responses, the mind will learn to sense connections intuitively, without prolonged reasoning. It is important to keep a balance between a clear boundary and open interdependence. Boundaries help act concretely and not disperse. Openness helps see how actions affect the system as a whole. Practice will combine both principles when presence remains honest. Your personal will and care for others go hand in hand. In every concrete step, this responsibility is manifested. Such a combination removes the paralysis of doubt and turns the understanding of interdependence into a source of compassion and responsibility. In everyday life, this transformation is noticeable in small decisions. In tone of voice, in the timing of a reply, in how you react to an electronic message. Practice trains you to account for chain effects.
One word can change the course of a conversation. One pause can change an emotion. Sitting and breathing remain the laboratory where the connection is tested again and again. When you return to the support of the breath, your sensitivity to the network increases, and actions become more proportionate to context. The conclusion is simple and concise. Accepting interdependence as a working rule does not free one from choice. It turns choice into an art of accounting for conditions.
In this art, clarity, gentle steadiness, and constant verification of results are important. If you train attention to recognize the co-arising of phenomena and immediately see the consequences of your responses, interdependence will become not a source of fear, but a platform for responsible and lively action. There is a moment that always serves as a test of the truthfulness of your mind. On the one hand, there is the habitual stream of thoughts with past and future, with worry about the past and plans for tomorrow. On the other hand, lies the right now. What remains when thoughts quiet and the ordinary story stops? This contrast is simple and concrete. One register pulls you along the temporal line. The other holds attention in immediate experience. To understand the difference is to have a tool for assessing the authenticity of your inner state. The present moment test works like a direct survey of attention. It asks about the inner factual situation, not about the story you tell about yourself. Look at any emotion: bitterness, excitement, fatigue. First you hear the explanation in thoughts, then you can drop your gaze inward and notice bodily signals: density of breath, heaviness in the chest, tension in the throat. It is these signals that indicate the presence of the state here and now. Dogen Daiken paid attention to sitting as a way to present the fact of presence. In sitting, the test manifests by itself, without words and reasoning. How to know that the check has been conducted honestly? You pose a brief question to attention and observe the answer. The question can be quiet and direct. What is felt right now? The answer comes in the body or in the tone of the breath. Sometimes it is quiet, almost imperceptible. Sometimes loud and sharp. This skill is trained. Hakuin Kaku insisted on constant checking in simple actions because the habit of answering with attention forms the truth of experience. The key is that the criterion is not a thought about truth, but the very fact of experiencing in the present moment. There is a practical sequence that turns this test into a working habit. Stop for a second. Direct attention inward. Notice a concrete tone or bodily signature. This three-step movement is not difficult if repeated. Shunryu Suzuki showed how returning to the support of the breath instantly reveals where you are, in the past, in the future, or right here. Returning to the breath is the simplest indicator of presence. A small example will help feel the mechanism. You open a letter and feel irritation. First images and accusations arise. Then you discover a throbbing in the neck and accelerated breathing in the body. If you stop and count breaths, the feeling will change tone, and the decision will follow from the clearer space. This quick experience is the exam of the present moment. Structural analysis is useful, but do not overload the mind with theory. The reason for the habit of getting lost in time lies in recurring thoughts and in the habit of interpreting sensations as stories.
The mechanism of the test is attention as a sensor that registers the fact of experience. The consequences of applying it are simple. Decisions become more accurate, reaction less automatic, and life more coherent with what is actually present. This analytical triad shows why the test is valuable. It is grounded in a reason, operates through a real mechanism, and produces a concrete effect in behavior. The present moment test does not require long practice or complicated techniques. It demands itself right now.
Linji Yishuan spoke of a simple opening of the mind when encountering experience. That opening is the ability to distinguish the experience from the story. Often a single deep breath is enough to see where you are, in action or lost in thought. The point is to give yourself a short pause before responding, to assess the initial data that are always already at hand. A teacher can accelerate recognition of the test, but cannot substitute it. When a teacher silently mirrors your state, they point to the mismatch between the narrative and the fact of experience. In such mirroring situations, the apparent simplicity returns you to the criterion of the present moment faster than many discussions. I have seen a single calm remark shift a student from a literal story into contact with the bodily fact, and that was far more useful than 100 words. Practice should be gentle and consistent. Strong effort rarely brings a durable effect. Better are short, frequent checks. While standing in line, in conversation, reading a message. Each such test strengthens the attentional cortex, making it more sensitive to bodily and breathing signals. Gradually, the recognizability of the present increases, and the check becomes intuitive. Then the criterion ceases to be a mere theoretical abstraction and turns into a habit of managing your own state. There are limits to this examination. Sometimes the body signals diversely and contradictorily, and then patience and careful observation without haste are required. Sometimes trauma or severe physical exhaustion blocks access to subtle data, and other approaches are needed. But usually, this test is available to everyone because it relies on what is already present, on breathing and sensations. Hakui Nekaku and Dogen Daiken both pointed to direct checking as a path to clarity, and their instructions converge on one thing: truth here and now is discoverable. Consolidating the skill looks simple and decisive. When, before a choice, you pause, notice the body, and give a minute of attention, you are applying the criterion. This shortens the distance between seeing and acting. Testing with the present turns practice from an abstraction into a daily tool of honesty. Stick to this approach, and the moment will cease to be a theoretical measure. It will become your habitual response. Language functions as a tool for pointing to meaning. Words ease the encounter with real experience, but they do not become the ultimate repository of truth. A word creates a direction of attention. It shapes the contours of attention and sets the frames of perception, while meaning unfolds in experience when the movements of mind and body touch the moment. This thesis defines the practical role of speech. It serves as a bridge that leads to experiential knowledge, not as a replacement for the path itself. The explanation concerns how words actually work. Every formulation rests on the common flash of habitual images and categories. An uttered phrase activates memory, expectation, and motives for action. Nevertheless, an instruction followed by invested attention and action becomes a source of meaning. When you speak of compassion, the true meaning manifests not through verbal description, but through tone of voice, speed of breathing, steadiness of intention, and subsequent action. Language economizes the power of attention. It packages a complex state into a convenient sign, but the unpacking requires bodily and attentive checking. In practice, this means that the word should provoke questioning inside checking, not serve as the final answer. The boundary of the two is visible within its domain of applicability. Words lose precision when attempting to describe paradoxical experiences, when experience contradicts habitual schemas of thought, or when body and mind indicate that language cannot hold it. In such situations, meaning becomes subtler and requires presence rather than additional interpretation. There are states where silence and action disclose meaning more fully than verbal explanation. This does not devalue speech, but marks its limits. Understanding the boundaries of language helps choose the form of expression depending on the depth of experience and the intent of communication. The practical consequence of this clarity shows up in how one treats speech in daily practice. Formulate a conclusion or instruction so that it leaves room for checking. Speak plainly, but leave space for the body and attention to hear their confirmation. When speech acts like a finger pointing at the moon, do not try to make the finger into the moon. The instrumentality of words presupposes discipline. Train yourself to notice how a phrase affects the tone of your mind and the choice of action, and adjust speech according to the result of that check. Thus, language becomes flexible, applicable, and honest. The epistemological side of this topic is traced in how concepts are formed. Words condense experience and make it available for transmission. At the same time, they create expectations that influence perception of subsequent events. Meaning through practice is born when a concept is confirmed or refuted in action and experience. This process is not romanticized. It is simple and methodical. Formulation, application, returning attention to the body and to the result. With each cycle, the check refines the boundaries of the term and makes language more precise in service of experience. There is also an ethical side to the use of speech. Language used without attention can cement illusions and lead to self-deception. Responsibility consists in not expanding the meaning of a word by force of persuasion, but in allowing meaning to manifest through concrete manifestation. In practice, this means care in statements, readiness to hear resistance, and to adjust formulation if it does not elicit confirmation in action. Such delicacy makes speech a means of respect for another's reality and for one's own checking. Dog and Daikin often returned attention to the link between word and deed, emphasizing that true understanding manifests in execution. Dog and Daikin reminded that writings and verbal instructions serve as steps leading to direct experience, and that these steps acquire meaning only in the movement of body and mind. In his approach, word and action prove inseparable, and Dog and Daikin showed that their combination creates a mindful life of practice. Repeating this thought in your own experience, you notice how words lose pretensions to absoluteness and become a living support for checking. It is in this key that Dog and Daikin helps keep the word in the service of practice and not allow it to take the place of experience. Practice teaches caution. Propositions, instructions, and teachings should be taken as hypotheses subject to testing. Every act of speech is an invitation to experiment. If the response is alive, the word performs its function. If not, one should change form or fall silent.
This requires honesty and courage to acknowledge that previously given formulas did not work, and readiness to revise them in light of new experience. Interaction with others poses another task. Listen to how the word affects the addressee and take their feedback into account. In dialogue, meaning grows not from the force of argument, but from shared attention, in which the word becomes an instrument for creating a common field of checking. When the word is accompanied by deed, it becomes testable and humble. Otherwise, it risks turning into dogma or an instrument of power. You can practice this attitude towards speech through daily microchecks. After giving an instruction, observe the body's reaction, assess the result, and be ready to change course. Observation includes listening to inner images and physical sensations. Where tension arises, where calm. This is a window for adjusting intention. Sometimes it is useful to ask directly, "What do you feel?" or "What happened in the body?" The question should be simple so as not to clutter the space with interpretations. This approach strengthens trust in the word and simultaneously in experience. The word ceases to be final and becomes an invitation to join checking. At the community level, such an attitude fosters a culture where knowledge is tested rather than proclaimed, where the teacher's profession becomes service rather than an act of authority. In the end, respectful treatment of the word is a way to preserve openness of mind and depth of action, allowing each word to become the beginning of a path rather than its replacement. Let the word remain a servant. The problem is that the inevitability of change and the reality of death often remain blurred or declarative in practice. They do not affect the body and behavior. Outwardly, ritual, verbal formulations, and even regular sitting may remain, while the attitude toward the end of life continues to live in hidden fear, in postponing important conversations, in delayed decisions. This creates an internal split. The mind utters truths about transience, while the body reacts with fear at every serious loss. The sharpest version of the problem is when reflection on death turns into an aesthetic topic, an intellectual parable, but does not pass through the breath, through muscle reaction, and through concrete deeds. Then the promise of freedom from attachment is not fulfilled, because the principle of impermanence did not become a criterion for life. The criterion of proper work with impermanence is evident in the body and in relation to action. Measure presence by the tone of the inner reaction to loss, by the ability to remain clear and open when confronted with grief, by the level of compassion and by the reordering of priorities. If at the thought of your own death, or when facing loss, the tone of attention becomes constricted, if decisions are made from panic, then the practice has not passed the test. If the breath remains even, if the voice stays tolerable, if the hands tend toward care rather than closing off, then transformation is happening. The criterion is at once simple and strict. Does the body turn toward presence at the moment when habitual supports disappear? This is not a philosophical declaration, but a diagnostic tool. Observation of reaction, of the speed of switching attention, of how quickly the will returns to care rather than avoidance. The consequences of working by this criterion are visible on several levels. On a personal level, such practice changes the structure of time. Plans are kept, but lose formal rigidity. Goals become more transparent, and you loosen your grip on things that once seemed necessary. Relationships deepen because readiness to face finitude teaches you to listen and to be present where another's pain requires accompaniment. The ethical side manifests in broader compassion. Understanding that everything passes frees one from the desire to control and allows action from care rather than from advantage. In sitting practice, this will show up as a change in the quality of attention. Less coquettish striving for mystical experience and more attention to the simple fact of breathing, to the boiling of heart reactions at the thought of loss. In the social field, such changes lead to death ceasing to be a taboo. Discussions about care and plans for illness become everyday discipline, and communities learn to support both those who are leaving and those who remain. Dogen Daiken emphasized this in his texts through the idea that practice and mortality go side by side, that preparing for dying is not an existential exercise, but a form of life. Practice checked by the body requires concrete forms of work. Meditation on impermanence should be combined with exercises that stir somatic memory. Mindful presence at funerals, simple rituals of forgiveness and initiation of farewell. The habit of bringing up final questions while there is still strength and clarity. These forms should be subtle and respectful. They should enhance the ability to be with another, not satisfy intellectual curiosity. Huineng spoke of enlightenment manifesting in the body, and this is precisely about knowledge of finitude, not remaining a thesis, but becoming the movement of hands and shoulders, voice and gaze at the last minute. The practice of death changes routine so that trifles cease to gather authority over life. Tomorrow's plans are made with the inevitability of loss in mind, and this reduces the inner tension that prompts pointless accumulation. There are consequences called liberation, and they are real. Softness of mind, clarity in choice, greater naturalness in saying farewell to what has gone. But honesty is important. Working with death does not guarantee freedom from pain. Death remains a trauma, but the way it is processed changes. The change appears in the ability to hold grief without hardening, in the capacity to continue acting even when the heart breaks, and in the integration of the experience of loss into the flow of life, rather than its repression. Bodhidharma in the tradition pointed to a direct encounter with the reality of being. Here that means allowing oneself to experience the ending without closing down at the level of movement and breath. The boundary that must be understood lies in the limits of methods and in the ethical field of their application. Practices of death do not claim to be a universal cure for all suffering, and are not an excuse for neglecting social obligations and medical care. They do not replace concrete measures of support in illness, are not a tool for manipulating other people's emotions, and are not a way to demonstrate spiritual status. When introducing such practices, it is important to consider individual trauma history, cultural context, and the person's readiness. Overloading someone with silent rituals can deepen a split rather than heal it. Dogen Daiken stressed bodily caution in practice. This means respecting the limits of body and psyche, introducing the theme of death slowly and with accompaniment, not as an idea for the sake of ideology. Another boundary is metaphysical. Work with impermanence improves the ability to live fully and compassionately, but it does not provide guarantees about what happens after death. From the Zen point of view, this is not a problem, because the aim of practice is transformation of the way of being, not accumulation of doctrines. The boundary is clear. Practice frees one from obsession and from predictions, but does not eliminate wonder and the unknown that remain part of human experience. Huineng and other masters point to the need for direct experience. This means accepting that some questions will remain without verbal resolution, and that presence in the moment is the principal criterion of meaning. Practice of death becomes service when it leads to greater care and clarity of action, and when it is introduced with respect for the limits of the person and society. If you begin to work with impermanence, watch the body, the tone of voice,
how readiness to care changes. Check yourself by the criterion of presence and by consequences for relationships. Remember the limits of the method and your responsibility. In this field, mortality ceases to be an abstract threat and becomes an aid in liberation that requires discipline and compassion at once. My main thought is simple. Zen is a system of relation to life where the criterion of truth lies in direct contact of mind and body. The word does not encompass the whole meaning. A formula does not replace experience, and therefore practice remains central. This is not a set of rules for the mind, but a path in which every thought is tested by a moment of attention and a movement of the body. I say this so that you feel that Zen asserts a way of being, not an idea to be accepted by the mind. When practice becomes a way of life, it changes the rhythm of the body and the character of decisions. Meditation ceases to be a time fragment and becomes a tone of presence in the affairs of the day. Intention tests the sincerity of actions. Motivation determines the depth of result. Speech acquires discipline because words expose vulnerability and can mislead if not confirmed by deed. Transmission remains face-to-face because there is a knowing that flashes in contact, and no book can trigger that shift by itself. A koan breaks habitual patterns of thought, opening space for direct experience. Emptiness of phenomena manifests not in negation but in lifting burdensome separations, and it is in this liberation that care appears. The beginner's mind preserves freshness of perception, and being able to remain a beginner is a skill cultivated continuously. The teacher serves as a mirror. The student's vulnerability is reflected, and through that reflection, the direction of practice is corrected. Bodily discipline and attentive sitting build a bridge between knowledge and action. The whole philosophical framework gains meaning through the present moment test. Presence in breath, voice, and gesture remains the main indicator of authenticity. If at loss, you are able to provide care. If in joy, the breath stays soft. If in doubt, the mind does not try to tangle its attention with 100 justifications, then the idea works. The practice of death is part of this field. Working with the end does not seek answers to what will come after. It trains the ability to be with what is, and helps free one from the grip that turns life into a series of accumulations and fears. It is a process that shifts priorities, changes the habit of planning as if everything were eternal, and allows more honestly arranged relationships and responsibilities. The limits are clear and strict. A technique has no right to claim a universal cure for all wounds. Ritual without inner change remains a gesture, and verbal wisdom without bodily checking can become an instrument of self-deception or a social show. Practice requires respect for individual trauma history and cultural context. Sudden interventions can aggravate wounds. The ethics of presence demands responsibility. Care for others and medical help are not replaced by spiritual exercises. There is also the danger of substituting discipline with demonstration of mastery and suggestion. A clear boundary lies between sincere work on oneself and using practice for self-assertion. Inner liberation does not grant immunity from pain. It changes the way pain is processed, not its existence. Distortions appear where Zen is turned into an aesthetic game or a dogma. If practice becomes a way to display one's spirituality,
if its instruments are used for manipulation, the meaning slips away. Sometimes insight is sought as a checkbox rather than as a foundation for change in relationships and care.
I have seen how direct attention to the moment was turned into rationalization without bodily checking. In such cases, one should return to simple criteria. What is the tone in the body? Where does care go? What decisions do you make under pressure? These indicators restore practice to its basics. Assembling the picture implies understanding the dialectic between discipline and spontaneity, between word and deed, between the individual and the interdependent. Discipline forms body and attention. Spontaneity shows up in the free movement of mind, and words become instruments for pointing to experience, but not substitutes for it. Transmission lives in contact and in the silence between utterance and understanding. Koan and sitting work together. The koan shakes the schema. Sitting preserves stability after the rupture. The body learns to be in the new position. Emptiness removes gestures of separation, making real care for others possible. Working with the finitude of life integrates all these elements into a form of service where liberation appears as greater readiness for action and as softness of presence in the face of pain. Such a picture is not reducible to a sequence of steps. It is a network of interconnections in which each node is checked by the moment. Key supports can be formulated as a brief mnemonic map for practice. Presence in the body, the main criterion. Intention distinguishes the honesty of actions. Transmission through contact matters more than impersonal knowledge. Discipline and spontaneity work together. Work with finitude converts understanding into care. These thoughts are not a list of commands, but reminders of which qualitative points should be checked in life.
Let them be the markers you return to when the inner pulse changes its rhythm and demands an answer.
My final request to you is simple. Go to your practice as if to a home, where every gesture and every breath can become an opportunity for enlightenment. Don't chase after ideas. Let the body and attention speak first. If you look closely and honestly, Zen turns out not to be a temple archaeology of words, but a way of living, so that departure and arrival happen with greater care and clarity. Good night.